Today we discussed an incredibly helpful yet endlessly misunderstood piece of drumming tech, the TuneBot by Overtone Labs. Well, like many drummers before me, I had a pretty steep learning curve when it came to tuning my drums. I scoured every corner of the internet, I read every magazine article I could, I asked every drummer I could find to try and figure out the secret to pulling the sounds that I heard in my head and putting them into the drums. But it seemed like no matter what I did, no matter how many things I read or how many questions I asked, I just still found myself swimming around in this endless dark sea of drum tuning and not really ever feeling like I had solid ground under my feet. And when by some miracle, whether it was blind luck or the drum gods finally smiled down at me, I made a drum sound good, as soon as it fell out of tune, I was never able to recreate it. You know, I was back to swimming around aimlessly in that deep, dark ocean once again, trying to get back to the sounds that I'd somehow stumbled on. And that's when this little guy came into my life. This little device caught my eye just after it launched, probably around 2012. It was marketed like a guitar tuner, but for drums. And that seemed to be what I was looking for. So naturally I picked one up as soon as I could. And within minutes of using it, I felt like that ocean I'd been stuck in had just kind of drained away. And the sun had come out and I had solid ground underneath my feet. And I could see where I was going. I could go to a destination and I could make educated decisions about it. And if I didn't like the sound that was coming to me in that place, I could go back to where I was with ease because I had a reference point. And references are important for understanding. And over time, this device became honestly one of my most trusted pieces of equipment. It rarely leaves my side. I use it every single day. While it's a fantastic piece of tech though, it's not without its quirks. And after a video of mine that featured the TuneBot went kind of viral, we got a lot of comments and it was clear to me that there were a fair few misconceptions about it. So I asked all my followers on YouTube, Instagram, and Patreon what they wanted to know about the TuneBot and how to get the most out of it. So this video is going to be a deep dive into how I use it, some little tips and tricks, some workarounds for some of the problems, and a little bit more information on the TuneBot. So let's dive in. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point that this is not a sponsored ad for the TuneBot at all. I have no affiliation to Overtone Labs. I'm not a TuneBot artist. I just really like the product. And because it features so heavily in a lot of my online content, I get a lot of questions about it. So I wanted to make a video to address all of that. However, if you're listening, TuneBot, I wouldn't be mad at a free one. This one's like 10 years old. It's a little dusty. So first, let's address some of the misconceptions about the TuneBot. The first one is that the TuneBot tunes your drums for you. I honestly have no idea how this came to be, but I've had a lot of people come to me and say like, oh, well, you're not really tuning the drum, the TuneBot is. That's not how this thing works. It just tells you what you've tuned it to. The second misconception is that the TuneBot replaces the need to tune by ear, and this is probably the one that I hear the most, and it honestly couldn't be further from the truth. The TuneBot works best, in my opinion, as an addition to good ear tuning practices. Like, you actually need to know how a drum works and how to get a drum vaguely in tune before you worry about something like a TuneBot to kind of fine tune it. You can't fix a poorly set up and tuned drum. It just holds up a mirror to the choices that you've made in your tuning approach. And if anything, it's strengthened my ability to tune by ear more than anything else that I've ever done, because it provides like clarity as to what you've done and a benchmark for every change you make. All it does is tell you the information, but it's information that you can then use. The third misconception is that the TuneBot can't actually read past 400 Hertz. And this seems to stem from their user manual stating that the tuning range is between 30 Hertz to 400 Hertz. But ultimately this is false. I'm not sure why it says that. I've had my original TuneBot up as high as like 450 and this thing's 10 years old. I know the new ones, the new studio models, has a high tuning function that you can turn on that takes it up to 450 and I believe increases the accuracy in that range. There are some caveats to getting this old one up that high. We'll get into that later in the tips and tricks, but just so you know, it's not limited to a 400 Hertz ceiling, but it's understandable why that information is out there, but just know that it is false. And finally, the last misconception, or at least contentious topic for debate, is that drums can't or shouldn't be tuned to notes. It's caused a bit of a stir in my snare tuning video where I showed the notes that I had tuned the top head to, and many commenters suggested that drums don't hold a pitched value, or that I was wrong or it was unnecessary to consider them to even have a pitch in the first place. I personally believe that's a pretty narrow view and ultimately limits what's possible with this instrument, but that's a topic for another video. If you want to see that video, I'm happy to oblige. But for now, let's just agree that it's pretty cool that we even have a tool that helps us tune to a pitch note if that's something that we want to do in the first place. When I started playing the drums, this didn't exist. To do that was far harder than it is now. So like it or not, this allows you to do it much easier. And I think that's cool. So knowing all of that, how do I like to use the TuneBot? Well, for general tuning, I use it as a reference point as I'm tuning up to get a sense of what the drum does at different ranges. And if it's my first time using a drum, it's a great kind of way of getting to know it. I can sort of hear some ranges that I like, take a note of what number they sit at, and I can always come back to those if I can't find a tuning range that I like better. It allows me to go straight there instead of swimming around in the dark again. I find the TuneBot really comes into its own as a fine tuning tool. You know, when the drum already sounds pretty good, but you want to take it that extra 10% further. You know, being able to measure in between each tuning rod as accurately as you can and really fine tune it, or talking about, you know, the interval between two different heads, especially on toms. You know, this is something that even with some ear training, most drummers can't do without years and years and years of practice. So it's a fantastic tool for that. I love taking the TuneBot on tour with me. You know, I can roll into a new city with a different backline kit waiting for me, jump on, and then within a couple of minutes, I've got it sounding basically the same as it did the night before. You know, this is good for making me feel comfortable and at home on the drum set, but it's also great for our sound guy because he can just load up last night's file on the desk. All his EQ moves are going to be pretty much in the same spot. It's going to mean less time hunting around for those weird frequencies and all the toms. It's just a time saver. It's a nice convenience to have. The only downside of taking this particular style of tuner on tour is that if you're in a noisy environment, it's going to be a lot harder for it to actually give you accurate readings, and it might actually just be reading other sounds around you instead of the drums. So that's the only downside of this, but if you're in a position where you get a bit of a sound check or you've got some quiet time outside the venue where you can dial in your drums, this is a great piece of equipment for that. And finally, the ultimate use for the TuneBot is in the recording studio. I personally think that every studio should have one of these. You can nerd out and tune an entire kit to the key of the song you're tracking if you want to. You can keep your drums in tune all session long. You get them dialed in, you start smacking the crap out of them. Oh no, the snare drum fell out of tune and we need to punch in a section in the second chorus. Oh, it's gonna sound all weird. It's okay. I can stick this on, tune it back to the number that we had it on at the start of the session. Boom, everything sounds great again. It just takes all the guesswork out of it. I've tried tone matching snares before the TuneBot in session. It's pain in the ass. With this, like, you don't even have to think about it. So if you're an engineer, you run a studio, get one of these, like, honestly, change your life. So let me take you through my entire process for tuning up a drum with the TuneBot now and show you some of the tips and tricks that I've picked up over the years to give you the best results. For this, we're going to be using this gorgeous 14 by 5.75 spotted gum snare, generously on loan to us from Steve at Evetts Drums. Thanks, Steve. This thing is beautiful. Can't wait to get it tuned up. Let's dive in. Now, the first thing I like to do when tuning a snare is to flip it over and deal with the bottom first. So let's do that. So before we get the TuneBot into play here, we have to make sure that the head is nice and evened out. I'm just going to go around and finger tight all of these tension rods, get them as cranked as I can with just my fingers. Now we're at that starting point. We're going to take our key, we're going to pick a tension rod, and we're going to do one full turn, and then we're going to do its opposite, and then go to the next lug in the sequence, and repeat, the next, full turn every time, the next, wind the mic. And now we're at one full turn across everything. Now the bottom snare head is actually a pretty thin head, and as a result, it's quite flexible and it can take pretty extreme ranges of tuning. Now we don't need to take it anywhere extreme, but a lot of people consider 400 Hertz a pretty extreme number. I don't. I think that's where snares just sound good. So we're going to take it there as a nice default setting. So we're just going to add full turns to the bottom of the drum one more time, all the way around. Now that we're at a point where this drum head's starting to feel a little bit firmer, we can pull in the TuneBot and actually start to get a bit of a read on what's going on. Okay, before we start tuning, I'm just going to gently lift these wires and carefully slide this stick under it. The reason I do this is so that the snare wires don't ring while I'm testing this head. While I'm testing, I'm also going to gently slide my index finger underneath the wires, just to the center of the head, and not press down, but just hold it gently so that it's kind of muting the middle of the head. And what that will allow me to do is that as I tap around here, it's going to sort of zoom in a little bit more on what's going on. Now, we're getting a lot of weird readings. We're getting 340s, we're getting 71, we're getting 118. You know, what is happening here? Now, this is where a lot of people get confused with the TuneBot in that it's giving us all these different readings. Which one do I believe? Well, in this case, we've added a fair bit of tension to the bottom head. It's probably sitting somewhere in that 300 range. So what I'm going to use is the filter button to essentially filter out all the noise down at 70 Hertz, 120, whatever else we were hearing, and just listen to 20% range around 340 odd hertz. So all I need to do is get one reading that is around the range that I suspect it to be at. I hit the filter button, and now as I go around, we're getting far more consistent results within a couple of hertz of one another. Great, we know that we're in the right spot. Now what we're gonna do is just add a small turn, maybe like a quarter turn on each lug and go around. Same as we did before, but just with a much smaller degree. And we're gonna test. 363, cool. Now here's the catch. We added tension, but we left the filter on when we checked it. So now let's turn the filter off and check what's really going on. Same sort of numbers, but now we know for sure. Let's hit the filter button again and continue to bring it up. So as you can see, as we get into these higher tuning ranges, the TuneBot can confuse itself fairly easily. So that's what the filter button is for. It's designed so that it just narrows that beam of what it's listening to around where you set it, and therefore you can get a much truer result, a more consistent result as you're sort of fine tuning your drum. Let's continue to bring it up because we're not quite near that 400 mark yet. Now it looks like we're around the 400 mark. Some lugs a little higher, some lugs a little lower. Let's fine tune it here. So I'm just going to go around the head and see which ones are higher and lower. So it seems like a few along this range are a little lower. Check. All right, we're in a pretty good spot. We're either getting about 400 or 399 on each of these tension rods. We still have a fair bit to do to the batter side head, so we'll leave that for now and flip it over. Now, the reason that we start with the Reso head first is that now as we bring the batter head up and we start making decisions about the tone of the drum, that bottom head is going to do what a snare drum head should do at every tuning range. It's going to sound nice and bright and snappy and airy and nice and rattly, but not so low that it has these weird overtones and ringing frequencies. It's just going to be a nice default setting. Now we can bring up this batter side head and we're going to use our TuneBot to kind of pick some notes along the way that we like. So starting out here with just fine tuning everything here with our hands, just bring it all up to a nice finger tight setting. Get our key once more, and we're gonna do the exact same thing, one full turn on everything. We have a drum. Now, let's see where we're at. Finger in the middle as before, not pushing, but just gently resting. The drum is extremely low. It's somewhere around 190 to 210. Some of these lugs are definitely out of tune, so let's go in and just sort of figure out, mostly by ear, but we'll use the TuneBot a little bit to figure out which ones are kind of closer than others. That was an important find there. This lug closest to my left leg was quite a bit lower. It obviously didn't get brought up quite enough in the finger tightening stage. We were just tapping along and just sort of moving them around until we found one of the problem lugs that just allowed the drum to open up. And as you can hear now, it's a lot more resonant. It has a nice openness. So let's actually get a proper reading now from the TuneBot. Now, much like before, we're getting a little bit of crosstalk and some different numbers from the fundamental of the drum. Let's use the filter button on the most common number, which was something around that 220 range, to kind of cut in and make sure we're listening to the right frequencies. All right, we've got the drum sitting around that 230 mark, which is extremely low. We're going to try it without any muffling. Trust me, it'll sound ridiculous. It's like a bad Saint Anger, but this is a tuning range that is so low you wouldn't use it without a lot, and I mean a lot of muffling. So let's throw a couple of gels on it just to demonstrate. We get that nice beefy kind of tuning. Great. Sounds good. So you can use this, it just requires a fair bit of muffling. Right, let's keep bringing it up. Now we're sitting somewhere around the 260 mark. Let's see what that sounds like. Sounds good, but it's got a really long ring to it. Let's put a little bit of a gel on there. So it's definitely a usable tone, although without the muffling, it's pretty wild. You might get away with it in some circumstances, but for the most part, you're probably going to want to muffle this down a little bit, but not as much as with the lower 230-ish range. Let's keep going. All right, 280 hertz on the top now. This is definitely a more normal snare tuning range, still on the lower medium side, but it'll sound a little bit less crazy without the muffling. Let's try it out. Still got a bit of a ring. Let's chuck the gel on, see if that just tones it in a bit. If anything, that gel placement was a little aggressive. Let's back it off a little bit, open the drum up a bit more. Awesome. Now we're in a good spot. Like, to me, this would be one of those numbers that I would write down. 280 hertz sounds great. Let's keep adventuring. Let's see what else we get. All right, 293 hertz now. I've stopped at this very obscure number because it's actually related to a particular pitch that I think sounds great on a lot of drums. It's the note D. This is going to be the ringing frequency. The fundamental of the drum is actually going to sit a little lower. I can turn the filter off and show you. So the fundamental of the drum sits around 211, but the actual ringing frequency is around 293, which is going to give us that nice D note ringing out after the fundamental of the drum. Let's check this out. I think that sounds pretty good. Let's chuck a gel on it, tighten up that ring a little bit. Awesome, sounds great. Let's keep going. All right, we're at a D sharp now. Let's give it a test. It's got a nice natural ring to it. You can see the higher we get, the less ring the drum has. Very cool, let's do a couple more. All right, we're around the note E, which is about 327 hertz. Let's see what this sounds like. Ooh. So as you can see, as we're going up, we're hitting all these different markers. We can kind of keep in mind, okay, the drum sounded great there, but if I wanted that lower beefy tuning, I could go back down to 230 or 260. So you can kind of see how important it is to have that reference point as you're going. So the last thing I want to do is demonstrate a little stair stepping technique, which is essentially taking the bottom head up to those higher ratings like the 450. Let's check it out. We're going to start with the bottom head around 400 at 399. We've got the filter set, and we're just going to basically bring it up a little bit until we can get a slightly higher reading. 417. Hit the filter button. Bring it up again. 432. Hit the filter button. Bring it up again. 451. So as you can see, it's not limited to 400 hertz. You just need to know how to use it. So as I mentioned earlier, I put the word out in my social media when I started making this video to make sure that I got all of the questions that you guys wanted answered. And I think we've covered most of them in the video, but there were a few specific ones that I wanted to address directly. Dwayne Shanks asks, oftentimes I can't get an accurate reading on the resonant snare head. Well, as we discovered in that snare tune-up test, this is a pretty common problem. It can be everything from the actual batter side of the drum still resonating, in which case you could solve that by putting a towel under it or tuning it up on a throne or on the ground. If that's not the case, then perhaps what it is the fundamental of the resonance side actually kicking off, in which case, using that little gentle finger tap in the middle of the drum. If you're a little wary to do that, I've heard of some people using gels or like Vader buzz kills or just anything that's going to stop that whole head from resonating. Really what you're trying to do is localize the resonance to the tension rod or the area around the tension rod that you're trying to tune. So try that. Make sure to try the filter button if you can. And if you're finding it really hard, try backing down the Reso head to a level where the TuneBot can pick up the pitch and then bring it up in that stair step manner that I showed before. Frosted Jr. asks, what are the limitations that you know of it? I mean, as far as like, practical limitations in terms of like limitations that really matter, I don't really think that there are too many. I mean, I'm not sure you could get the TuneBot to go above 500 hertz, but honestly, I don't really know why you would want to. I don't think there's too many drums, especially like snare Reso heads, that would ever want to go that high. I think within the spectrum that we work in, it tends to cover all of its bases. The only main limitation that I find I run into with it is like trying to tune with it in noisy environments. I touched on this when I was talking about, taking it on tour. But yeah, definitely if there's any other noise in the area that's like, as loud or louder than the drums that you're trying to tune, it's going to pick that up. And especially low frequencies, low frequency information has a way of sort of just traveling like a juggernaut through anything around it. So the TuneBot has a tendency to lock into those frequencies. So if you can't find a quiet place to tune, that can sometimes be a bit of an issue. Probably one of the biggest limitations I wanted to address here is actually in regards to the TuneBot gig model. I don't know what's going on with this model, but every one that I've used, and I've used multiple, a lot of my friends and students have gone out and bought the TuneBot after seeing some of my videos. And the gig is a slightly cheaper model that just seems to have the main functionality, but without all the bells and whistles. However, everyone I know who's bought one has had some really weird complaints with it, like they can't get their snare resos up to 400, the frequencies are jumping all around all the place. I'm not sure what's going on. Maybe someone from TuneBot can chime in if they see this video, but it seems like the gig's readings are different to the original and the studio version. I can't at all recommend people go and buy the gig version because I've found it nothing but inconsistent. Maybe I'm missing something there, but I have messed around with it and A/B'd it against my original one, which I know to be quite accurate, and it just doesn't seem to do the job. So if you are having some issues, that could be why. Nick Butler asks, are there any drums that you can't get to 400 hertz for the Reso? My Tama Dynamic Bronze was struggling to get there. Old head maybe? Or do some drums have limitations like that? And CSG Musical has also chimed in with same thing for a DW 14x5. Can't get it to read much on the Reso. It has a Diplomat too, so is that too thin to be loud enough to be accurate reading? What about ambient noise? As far as ambient noise, unless you're tuning it in an extremely loud environment, I don't think that would have anything to do with it. As far as drums, I've never met a snare drum that was decently built that I couldn't get to 400 hertz. The only drums that even come to mind as having any sort of difficulty in getting up that high are drums with poorly made hardware. Hell, I've even got those up to 400 hertz for some of my students. So I don't think so much that it has to do with the drum. That maybe says to me that your TuneBot is either the gig version that gives some odd readings, or perhaps it is clicking into a lower fundamental, in which case you can try some of the muting techniques that I've shown in this video. Or perhaps it's just the case that you need to bring that Reso head down to a level where you can get a reading on it, maybe somewhere around that 300 mark, and then in that stair step method, bring it up to 400. Hope that helps. Over to Instagram now, and Ivan Molina asks, the true, does it work or it doesn't? It does. Green Hopek asks, best Reso hertz for snare. I actually covered this in the video that kind of blew up on Instagram that I think a lot of people maybe know me for at this point. 400 hertz. We demoed it in this video. It just works extremely well. That's for a 14-inch. You can go a little bit higher. The Paramore snare video I made, we ended up going up to 455 hertz. That wasn't a very deep drum. That was a 14x8. So I kind of think of it as like, maybe the deeper the drum, the higher you can go to give it a little bit of extra life, a little bit more snap and attack and articulation. Whereas if it's a thinner drum, you kind of want to preserve a bit of that low end. The shell doesn't naturally have it. So you could maybe go a little lower, maybe 380 would be maybe as low as I might go, unless I was going for something very specific. As far as general tunings, anything in that 400 hertz ballpark, that'll do. David Pasterek asks, please share some 14x5.5 snare tunes. That's why I picked the drum that we did. That, and it's awesome, and Steve sent it to me to make videos with. But try those tunings out. See if they work for you. Razvan44 asks, is it worth the money and does it provide significant results compared to just tuning by ear? Look, nothing will replace tuning by ear. At the end of the day, if you can tune by ear, you don't need these gadgets. However, as someone who can tune by ear, I also find a lot of value in these gadgets. I think that there's something to be said for having a reference point, for being able to quickly, recall a setting. It's just a quality of life improvement. So if you've got a spare couple $100 and you want to mess around with your tuning and see if you can kind of take it to another level, I highly recommend it. Chris Stath asks, anything tuning related? Toms, I'm struggling to tune mine. Toms are tricky, especially because depending on how many toms you have to get them all working together as a set. The TuneBot actually does have its own app, which has a tuning calculator that you can use to generate a bunch of potential tunings for your entire set. You can put in how many drums you have, what size they are, how much resonance you want, and it will actually generate you some numbers that you can try out. That might be a really good place to start. As well as that, I made a reel about tom tuning over on my Instagram and my TikTok. You can check that out. Lewis Dimitropoulos asks, is it really worth it? Tuning by ear works great. I'm just worried I'll get caught up in the numbers. Yeah, look, fair, right? I think you should just consider the numbers as a reference point. They don't have to be something you aim to. They can just be something that you use as a signpost along the way. If you find something you really like, you can whip out your TuneBot, you can take measurements of it, you can write it down and go, great, I like that. It doesn't have to be a replacement for tuning by ear. It can just be something that accentuates it and you can use to kind of almost create a save file of your favorite tunings. Good Green Beans asks, why the fuck does it randomly jump from 300 Hertz to 100 Hertz while having the exact same pitch? Filter button, muting the heads, do you own the gig? In talking to Mr. Green Beans himself, I actually found out he does own the gig and that is probably the issue that he is facing. Hope that helps. If you have any other questions about the TuneBot, please leave them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. If we get enough questions, I might even make a part 2 to this video. If you enjoyed this, I'd really appreciate if you checked out my Patreon page. There's a whole bunch of other videos and content, drum samples, tutorials, deep dives, how-tos. Go over there, check it out. I'm adding as much content there as frequently as I can. Your support means a lot and it goes a long way to helping me make more of this stuff. So if this is something that you'd like to see more of, I'd really appreciate if you considered supporting me over there. As always, hit the like button, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you on the next one.